The merciless summer sun beat down on Thomas Blackwood's parched land like it had a personal vendetta against him. 3 months without a drop of rain had transformed his once thriving cattle ranch outside Dry Creek, Arizona territory, into a wasteland of cracked earth and withering hope. The year was 1885, and the West was still wild, but the true adversary wasn't outlaws or Indians. It was the relentless drought that threatened everything he'd spent 15 years building. Thomas wiped sweat from his weathered brow as he stared at the skeletal remains of what had been his prize bull, fallen beside the dried-up creek bed that gave the nearby town its now ironic name. His cattle were dying, one by one, despite his desperate efforts to dig deeper wells and ration what little water remained. At 43, the lines etched into his sun-leathered face told the story of a man who had weathered many storms. But this drought might be the one that finally broke him. "Damn it all," he muttered, kneeling beside the carcass. Another loss he couldn't afford. With calloused hands, he removed his worn leather hat, revealing streaks of gray cutting through his dark hair, and held it against his chest in a moment of silent mourning. Not just for the animal, but for the dying dream of prosperity that had brought him west after the war between the states. The long ride back to his ranch house felt even longer with the weight of failure pressing down on his shoulders. The modest two-story structure stood as a testament to more prosperous times, when he'd imagined filling it with family. Instead, it had become a solitary man's fortress against the world, with only the company of his loyal cattle dog, Scout, who now trotted beside his horse with tongue lolling in the heat. As Thomas dismounted at the hitching post, his neighbor Eli Jackson rode up in a cloud of dust, his own face grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Eli's ranch was larger, with access to a deeper well that had sustained him through previous dry spells, but even he was feeling the strain now. "Tom," he called out, tipping his hat. "Came to see how you're holding up." Thomas tied his horse and offered a grunt in response. "Lost another one today. That makes 7 this month." Eli dismounted, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a thud. "Same over my way. Never seen it this bad." He followed Thomas onto the shaded porch, where Thomas poured them each a meager cup of water from a canteen. Both men sipped slowly, treating the liquid like the precious commodity it had become. "Thinking of selling what cattle I got left," Thomas admitted, the words tasting as bitter as defeat. "Move on, maybe to Oregon. Heard it rains plenty up there." Eli studied his friend's face. They'd arrived in the territory around the same time, both chasing the promise of land and liberty. "You'd leave all this behind? After everything you built?" Thomas gestured to the barren landscape that stretched out before them. "What's left to leave, Eli? Land ain't worth spit without water. And a man can only fight nature for so long before he has to admit he's beaten." Eli leaned against the porch railing, considering his words carefully. "Well, before you pack up, you might want to hear about the telegram that came into town yesterday. Eastern Relief Society's sending orphans west again. Train's due in Tucson next week." Thomas scoffed. "What's it got to do with me? Town council's looking for placements. Families willing to take in children, give him a home, put him to work. Most are girls this time, I hear. I'm the last man who should be raising children, especially girls," Thomas said firmly. "Haven't got the temperament nor the means, particularly now." "Maybe so," Eli replied, finishing his water. "But they come with a stipend. Government money to help with their care. Might be enough to tide you over till the rains come." Thomas shook his head. "I won't use children as a meal ticket. Besides, what kind of life could I offer them here? Can barely keep myself alive." Eli mounted his horse, adjusting his hat against the glare of the setting sun. "Just thought you should know. Meetings tomorrow at the schoolhouse. They're desperate for placements." He paused, then added quietly, "Sometimes salvation comes in forms we don't expect, Tom." After Eli rode away, Thomas sat alone on the porch as darkness fell, staring up at the cloudless sky. The stars emerged, brilliant and cold, indifferent to the suffering below. Scout laid his head on Thomas's boot, offering the simple comfort of companionship. "What do you think, boy?" Thomas murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Think I've got any business taking in orphans?" Scout whined softly in response. Later that night, Thomas knelt beside his bed for the first time in months. He wasn't much for praying, had seen too much during the war to put much stock in divine intervention, but desperation drove him to his knees. "Lord," he whispered hoarsely into the darkness, "I ain't asked for much, and you ain't given much lately, so I reckon we're about even. But I'm asking now, send rain. That's all. Just rain." He climbed into bed, feeling foolish. The land needed water, not the fumbling prayers of a worn-out rancher. Yet as he drifted off to sleep, the thought of children, young lives uprooted and shipped west like cargo, troubled his dreams. Morning brought no clouds, no promise of relief, but it did bring a decision. Thomas saddled his horse and rode into town for the first time in weeks, dust billowing behind him like a shroud. Dry Creek was little more than a main street with a handful of businesses, a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, the sheriff's office, and the one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays. It was at the schoolhouse that the town council had gathered, along with nearly every family in the area. Thomas slipped in late, standing at the back as Mayor Holbrook, a portly man with a perpetually damp forehead, addressed the crowd. "As you all know, we're facing hard times. This drought has hit every one of us. But these children coming from back east have faced hardships too. Orphaned, abandoned, living in conditions you wouldn't believe. The Relief Society has asked if our community can take in 6 girls, ages 8 to 16. A murmur rippled through the gathering. Families were whispering, calculating whether they could afford another mouth to feed. "There's a government stipend," the mayor continued, $20 a month per child for their care and education. "Now, I know that's not a fortune, but we'll take 2, called out Mrs. Peterson, whose husband ran the general store. "Our Sarah's been asking for sisters." Mayor Holbrook nodded, making a note. "Thank you, Petersons. That's 2 placed. We can manage one," offered the blacksmith's wife timidly. "A older girl who can help with the little ones." "Excellent. 3 accounted for." Thomas shifted uncomfortably as the meeting continued. He'd come intending to offer a home to 1 child, just 1, enough to secure the stipend without completely upending his life. But as he listened to the families volunteering, he realized they were the stable ones, with mothers and established homes. What did he have to offer but a failing ranch and his own grim company? The room fell silent as the mayor announced, "That's 3 girls with homes. We still need placements for the other 3, or they'll be sent on to California." Thomas found himself stepping forward before he'd fully formed the thought. "I'll take them," he said, his voice rough from disuse. All heads turned toward him, faces registering various degrees of surprise. Thomas Blackwood was known as a loner, a man who came to town only when necessary for supplies or to sell cattle. "All 3?" Mayor Holbrook asked incredulously. Thomas swallowed hard, wondering if he'd lost his mind. "Yes, all 3. The schoolteacher, Miss Abigail Clark, a stern-faced woman in her 30s who'd come west from Boston 5 years earlier, stood up. "Mr. Blackwood, with all due respect, do you have any experience with children? Girls in particular?" "No, ma'am, I don't," he admitted, "but I have a solid house with empty rooms. Got land, even if it's dry at the moment. And I'm willing to learn." Miss Clark frowned. "These aren't cattle, Mr. Blackwood. They're children who've already faced significant trauma." "I'm aware of that," Thomas replied, an edge creeping into his voice. "I also know something about trauma myself, and about making a new start in a strange place." The mayor cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should put it to a vote." "No need," Thomas interrupted. "If the council doesn't think I'm suitable, I'll withdraw my offer. But those girls need homes, and I have one to give." Miss Clark studied him for a long moment, then turned to the mayor. "I propose a compromise. Mr. Blackwood can take in the 3 remaining girls, but I'll check in regularly to ensure their welfare. At the first sign that the arrangement isn't working, alternative placements will be found." The mayor looked relieved. "That seems reasonable. Mr. Blackwood." Thomas nodded stiffly. "Fine by me." And just like that, Thomas Blackwood, who had lived alone for 15 years with only a dog for company, had committed to becoming the guardian of 3 orphan girls he'd never met. As he rode back to his ranch that afternoon, His mind raced with all the preparations he'd need to make. The upstairs bedrooms hadn't been used in years. He needed to clean, make beds, purchase supplies he'd never had reason to think about before. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and crimson over the parched landscape, Thomas found himself back on his knees. "Lord," he whispered, "I asked for rain, and you're sending me girls instead. I sure hope you know what you're doing, because I haven't got the faintest idea what I'm getting myself into." As if in answer, a hot wind stirred the dust outside, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes began to howl. The Tucson train station bustled with activity as Thomas Blackwood stood awkwardly on the platform, hat in hand, watching passengers disembark from the eastbound train. Steam billowed around the locomotive, momentarily obscuring his view of the children being herded by a severe-looking woman in a gray traveling suit. Thomas had spent the past week in a frenzy of preparation. He'd cleaned the upstairs bedrooms that had gathered dust for years, aired out linens, repaired a broken window, and even purchased 3 simple bed frames from the carpenter in town. The general store had nearly depleted its inventory, supplying him with items he'd never before needed: hair ribbons, girls' undergarments, dress fabric, and primers for reading lessons. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad," said a familiar voice beside him. Thomas turned to find Miss Abigail Clark, the schoolteacher, standing primly with her hands folded before her. "Feel like it too," he admitted gruffly. Miss Clark's normally stern expression softened slightly. "It's a significant undertaking, Mr. Blackwood, but these girls need stability more than anything. Just be patient and consistent." Before Thomas could respond, the woman in gray approached, consulting a ledger. "Mr. Blackwood?" she inquired, peering at him over wire-rimmed spectacles. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Mrs. Eleanor Winters, representative of the Eastern Relief Society." She gestured toward the huddle of girls standing a few paces behind her. "I understand you've agreed to take in 3 of our charges." Thomas nodded, his throat suddenly dry as he took in the sight of the children. They were a somber lot, dressed identically in plain brown dresses and white pinafores, their meager possessions clutched in small carpetbags. Their faces showed varying degrees of weariness, exhaustion, and fear. Mrs. Winters consulted her ledger again. "You'll be taking Charlotte Miller, age 16, Ruth Bennett, age 12, and Margaret Wilson, age 8. She beckoned to the girls, who stepped forward hesitantly. Thomas was struck by how different they were from one another. Charlotte, the eldest, was tall and thin, with watchful blue eyes and blonde hair pulled back severely. She stood slightly in front of the other 2, her posture suggesting both wariness and determination. Ruth was smaller, with a serious face framed by brown braids and eyes that seemed to take in everything. Little Margaret had a mass of unruly red curls and a smattering of freckles across her nose, her small hand clutching tightly to Charlotte's skirt. "Girls," Mrs. Winters said in a clipped tone, "this is Mr. Blackwood. He will be your guardian. You are to show him respect and obedience." Thomas cleared his throat. "Pleased to meet you all," he managed, the words feeling inadequate. Mrs. Winters thrust a packet of papers toward him. "These are their documents, birth certificates, what medical records we have, and the stipend agreement. The funds will be deposited monthly at your local bank. Miss Clark has agreed to monitor their education and welfare." She checked her watch. "Now, if you'll sign here, I must return to the train. We continue to Phoenix by nightfall." The transaction was completed with unsettling efficiency. Within minutes, Mrs. Winters had reboarded the train, leaving Thomas standing awkwardly with 3 silent girls and Miss Clark, who seemed to sense his panic. "Why don't we get these young ladies settled at your ranch?" she suggested. "I've arranged to accompany you today to help with the transition." Thomas nodded gratefully and led the way to his wagon, where he'd arranged clean straw in the back and a tarp for shade. He helped the girls climb aboard, noting how Charlotte positioned herself between the younger ones, her arm protectively around little Margaret. The journey to the ranch was largely silent. Occasionally, Miss Clark would point out landmarks or name local plants, but the girls remained quiet, taking in their new surroundings with wide eyes. Thomas caught Ruth staring at the desolate landscape with a furrowed brow. It ain't always this dry, he found himself saying. When the rains come, this all turns green. Wildflowers everywhere. Ruth looked at him skeptically, but said nothing. As they approached the ranch, Thomas felt a sudden self-consciousness about his home. It was solid enough, a two-story structure with a wide porch and sturdy outbuildings, but it lacked the touches that made a house inviting. No curtains hung in the windows, no flowers softened the yard, just the bare necessities of a bachelor's existence. Scout bounded out to greet them, barking excitedly at the newcomers. Margaret shrank back in fear, but Ruth leaned forward with interest. "That's just Scout," Thomas explained as he halted the wagon. "He won't hurt you. Best cattle dog in the territory." "Is he friendly?" Ruth asked, the first words any of the girls had spoken directly to him. "Friendliest dog you'll ever meet," Thomas assured her, relieved to have broken the ice, however thinly. He helped them down from the wagon, then carried their bags into the house. Miss Clark followed, guiding the girls with gentle words of encouragement. Inside, Thomas had done his best to make the main room welcoming. He'd swept and dusted, arranged the furniture, and even placed a vase of desert flowers on the table. The effect was still sparse, but it was cleaner than the house had been in years. "I'll show you to your rooms," he said, leading the way upstairs. "Got 3 bedrooms up here. Thought you each might like your own space, but if you'd rather share, that's fine too." The girls exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Margaret and I will share," Charlotte said firmly, her voice surprisingly steady. "She gets nightmares." Thomas nodded. "As you wish. Ruth can have the room next door, and a third can be for whatever you need." The bedrooms were simple but clean, each with a narrow bed, a small chest for clothing, and a washstand. Thomas had placed a rag doll on Margaret's pillow and books in Ruth's room, gestures that had felt foolish at the time, but now seemed woefully inadequate. "I'll leave you to get settled," he said awkwardly. "Come down when you're ready, and we'll have some supper." Downstairs, he busied himself preparing the simple meal he'd planned: beans, cornbread, and dried apple slices rehydrated in water. Miss Clark joined him in the kitchen, rolling up her sleeves to help. "They're frightened," she said quietly. "It's to be expected. They've been uprooted and sent across the country to live with a stranger." "What do I do?" Thomas asked, his voice low. "I don't know the first thing about raising girls." "You learn," Miss Clark replied simply. "Day by day. They need security, consistency, and kindness. The rest will come." She paused, then added, "Charlotte has been a mother to the younger ones at the orphanage. She won't easily relinquish that role. Don't fight it. Work with it." Thomas nodded, absorbing this advice. "And the stipend is to be used for their care," Miss Clark finished firmly. "Food, clothing, education. Not to save your ranch, Mr. Blackwood." He flushed, ashamed that his initial motivation had been so transparent. "I understand." When the girls came downstairs, they moved as a unit, Charlotte in the lead with Margaret's hand in hers, Ruth following closely behind. They sat at the table with straight backs and folded hands, waiting silently. Thomas served the meal, uncomfortably aware of their scrutiny. The food was plain but plentiful, more than they'd likely had at the orphanage, judging by their thin frames. "You can eat," he said when they continued to sit motionless. "Don't stand on ceremony here. We say grace first," Charlotte explained, her tone suggesting this was non-negotiable. Thomas flushed again. "Of course. Would you like to lead us?" Charlotte nodded and bowed her head. The others followed suit. "Dear Lord, thank you for this food and for safe travels. Please watch over us in this new place." "Amen. Amen," echoed Ruth and Margaret softly. The meal proceeded in awkward silence, broken only by Miss Clark's determined attempts at conversation. She asked the girls about their journey, their education at the orphanage, their interests. Gradually, Ruth began to respond, revealing that she enjoyed reading and had been at the top of her class. Margaret remained silent, her eyes darting occasionally to Thomas with undisguised apprehension. As they finished eating, Charlotte finally addressed him directly. "Where are our duties to be, Mr. Blackwood?" The question caught him off guard. "Duties?" "Yes, sir. What work will we be doing to earn our keep?" Thomas exchanged a glance with Miss Clark. "Well, I suppose you'll attend school in town. Help around the house some. Normal things children do. Charlotte's expression remained guarded. At the orphanage, we work from dawn until dusk. Cleaning, cooking, laundry, mending. This ain't an orphanage, Thomas said, perhaps more gruffly than intended. It's a home. You're home now. There'll be chores, sure, but you're children, not servants. A flicker of something, disbelief, perhaps, or hope, crossed Charlotte's face before she schooled her features back to neutrality. Yes, sir. After supper, Miss Clark announced it was time for her to return to town. Thomas walked her to her buggy, feeling a rising panic at being left alone with 3 strangers who were now his responsibility. I'll return in 3 days to check on things, she assured him, and the girls will start school next week. In the meantime, just talk to them. Get to know them. Let them get to know you. As her buggy disappeared down the dusty road, Thomas turned back to the house with a deep breath. Inside, he found the girls had cleared the table and were washing the dishes without being asked, working together with the efficiency of long practice. You don't have to do that tonight, he said. Must be tired from traveling. We're used to working, Charlotte replied, not looking up from the dish she was drying. Thomas watched them for a moment, then said, when you're finished, maybe we could sit on the porch. Evening's the best time here, cools down some. Could tell you about the ranch. The suggestion was met with polite nods, but little enthusiasm. Nevertheless, once the kitchen was spotless, they joined him on the porch. Thomas had brought out a lantern, which cast a warm glow against the gathering darkness. Scout settled at his feet, while the girls arranged themselves on the bench he'd recently repaired. Ranch is about 500 acres, he began, gesturing to the shadows of the land around them. Runs cattle mostly, though we're down to about 30 head now because of the drought. In good years, I keep around 100. What's a drought? Margaret asked suddenly, her small voice startling in the quiet. It was the first time she'd spoken directly to him, and Thomas felt a disproportionate sense of accomplishment. It's when there's no rain for a long time. Everything dries up, the grass, the creeks. Makes it hard on the cattle, hard on everyone. Margaret considered this. Is that why it looks so sad here? Thomas chuckled despite himself. I suppose it does look sad right now, but it won't always. When the rains come, this place transforms. The desert blooms. Will the rains come? Ruth asked, leaning forward with interest. Hard to say. Could be tomorrow, could be months from now. That's the way of things out here. Unpredictable. He looked up at the clear night sky, stars emerging like diamond dust scattered across black velvet. But they always come eventually. They sat in silence for a while, the distant howl of coyotes and the chirping of crickets the only sounds. Thomas felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders. This wasn't so difficult, sitting quietly with the girls. Perhaps he could manage this after all. What happened to Mrs. Blackwood? Charlotte asked abruptly. The question caught him off guard. There isn't one. Never was. You never married? Charlotte pressed, her tone suggesting she found this suspicious. No. Came west after the war. Been busy building this place. Which war? Ruth asked. The war between the states. I fought for the Union. This revelation seemed to interest Ruth. Did you kill people? Ruth, Charlotte admonished. That's not a proper question. Thomas regarded the serious-faced girl. Yes, I did. It's not something I'm proud of or like to talk about. Ruth nodded, accepting this answer with surprising maturity. As the evening grew cooler, Margaret began to yawn, her small body leaning increasingly against Charlotte's side. Thomas recognized this as his cue. Reckon it's time for bed, he said, rising to his feet. Got a big water barrel out back for washing up. Outhouse is just beyond the chicken coop. I'll show you in the morning where everything is, give you a proper tour of the place. Charlotte stood, guiding a sleepy Margaret to her feet. Thank you for taking us in, Mr. Blackwood, she said formally, though her eyes still held reservation. You can call me Thomas, he offered. Or Mr. Thomas, if that sits better. The girls nodded politely but didn't commit to either option. As they filed inside, Thomas remained on the porch, listening to their footsteps on the stairs, the soft murmur of voices as they prepared for bed. Later, as the house fell silent, he sat alone with Scout, contemplating the strange turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he'd been a solitary rancher facing financial ruin. Now he was responsible for 3 young lives, each carrying her own burden of loss and uncertainty. Prayed for rain, he murmured to Scout, who thumped his tail in response. Got girls instead. Still don't know if that's an answer or a test. As if an answer, a cool breeze stirred the dust in the yard, unusual for this time of year. Thomas lifted his head, sniffing the air. Beneath the familiar sense of sage and dry earth, there was something else, something he hadn't smelled in months. Moisture. He stood, scanning the horizon, and there, far to the west, a bank of clouds was building, barely visible against the night sky. It might amount to nothing, might drift away by morning, but it was more hope than he'd had in months. Thomas allowed himself a small smile as he headed inside to his own bed. Perhaps the arrival of the girls and the promise of rain were connected after all, in ways he couldn't yet understand. The first light of dawn found Thomas already at work in the barn, mucking out stalls and feeding the horses. He'd risen earlier than usual, a knot of anxiety in his stomach about facing the day ahead with his new charges. How did one care for 3 girls who had appeared suddenly in his life, like tumbleweeds blown in by a desert wind? He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't notice Charlotte standing in the doorway until she spoke. Mr. Blackwood, is there something I can help with? Thomas straightened, pitchfork in hand, surprised to see her awake so early. She was already fully dressed in one of her plain brown dresses, hair neatly braided, looking more like a young woman than the girl she still was. Didn't mean to wake you, he said. Sun's barely up. We always rose at 5 at the orphanage, Charlotte explained. I can help with chores before the little ones wake up. Thomas leaned the pitchfork against the wall. You don't need to be up this early here. Could sleep in if you wanted. Charlotte's expression suggested that such indulgence was foreign to her. I prefer to be useful. Thomas recognized the pride in her stance, the need to establish her value. It was a feeling he understood all too well. All right then, he conceded. Could help me gather eggs if you're willing. Chickens are ornery this time of morning. A hint of a smile touched Charlotte's lips. I've handled ornery chickens before. Together they walked to the chicken coop, where a dozen hens clucked indignantly as they entered. Charlotte moved among them with practiced ease, gently lifting each hen to check for eggs beneath. You've done this before, Thomas observed. We had chickens at the orphanage, she replied, placing eggs carefully in the basket he held. I was in charge of them the last 2 years. Before that, I remember helping my mother with chickens. Thomas hesitated, then asked, You remember your parents then? Charlotte's movements slowed slightly. Some. My father died in an accident at the mill where he worked when I was 7. My mother took in washing to support us, but she got consumption. After she died, there was nowhere for me to go but the orphanage. She delivered this history with such matter-of-factness that it took Thomas a moment to absorb the tragedy behind the words. 9 years in an institution, having lost both parents before she could even reach adolescence. I'm sorry, he said inadequately. Charlotte merely shrugged, continuing her task. It's the way things went. Ruth and Margaret have their own sad stories. Most children in orphanages do. They finished gathering eggs in silence, then moved on to other morning chores. Charlotte proved remarkably competent, anticipating what needed to be done without being told. By the time they returned to the house, the sun was fully up, and the smells of coffee and frying bacon greeted them. In the kitchen, they found Ruth at the stove, confidently turning strips of bacon in a cast-iron skillet. Margaret sat at the table, her red curls still tousled from sleep, carefully setting out plates and cups. You didn't need to cook, Thomas said, surprised. Ruth glanced up. We thought you and Charlotte might be hungry after chores. Margaret and I know how to prepare breakfast. Thomas set down the egg basket, oddly touched by this gesture. Well, thank you. It smells good. After breakfast, Thomas gave the girls a proper tour of the ranch, showing them the boundaries of the property, the cattle grazing on what little vegetation remained, the dried-up creek that would, he assured them, run again when the rains came. What do we do for water now? Ruth asked practically. Got 2 wells, Thomas explained. One near the house for household use, one by the north pasture for the cattle. They're low, but still producing. We can serve what we can. As they walked, Scout bounded ahead, occasionally circling back as if to check that everyone was following. Margaret, initially fearful of the dog, began to show interest, especially when Scout performed a trick at Thomas's command, rolling over in the dust. "Can I pet him?" she asked shyly. "Course you can," Thomas encouraged. "He loves attention." Margaret approached cautiously, then reached out a small hand to touch Scout's head. When the dog responded with an enthusiastic lick, she giggled, a high, sweet sound that seemed to lighten the air around them. The days that followed established a tentative routine. The girls, accustomed to strict schedules and hard work, threw themselves into ranch life with an eagerness that both impressed and concerned Thomas. They were up at dawn, completing household chores before he could protest. Charlotte took charge of the cooking, revealing a talent for making simple ingredients stretch into satisfying meals. Ruth proved to have a quick mind for figures and soon began helping Thomas with the ranch accounts. Margaret, still shy but warming gradually, became Scout's devoted companion and showed a surprising aptitude for gardening, tending the small kitchen plot with determined optimism despite the drought. Miss Clark visited as promised, bringing books and slates in preparation for the girls' attendance at school. She spent an afternoon assessing their education and pronounced them all remarkably advanced for their circumstances. "Charlotte reads at a high school level," she informed Thomas. "Ruth has a gift for mathematics. And Margaret, though behind in reading, shows a natural curiosity that will serve her well." Thomas nodded, pleased but unsurprised. The girls' intelligence had become increasingly evident in their daily interactions. "Will they fit in at the school?" he asked, mindful of the close-knit community where newcomers were often viewed with suspicion. Miss Clark's expression grew thoughtful. "There may be some adjustment. Children can be unkind about differences, but I'll ensure they're treated fairly in my classroom." The following Monday marked the girls' first day of school. Thomas drove them into town in the wagon, acutely aware of their nervous excitement. They wore their best dresses, freshly washed and pressed, hair neatly arranged. Charlotte, as always, maintained a protective stance near the younger girls. "Remember what we discussed," Thomas said as they approached the schoolhouse. "You're as good as any child here, better educated than most, according to Miss Clark. Hold your heads high." Ruth nodded seriously, while Margaret clutched Charlotte's hand tighter. Charlotte's expression remained guarded, but she squared her shoulders in silent determination. Thomas watched them enter the schoolhouse with a curious ache in his chest. In just a week, he'd grown accustomed to their presence, to the sound of their voices in his previously silent home. The ranch felt strangely empty as he drove back alone. He occupied himself with repairs he'd been postponing, but his thoughts kept returning to the girls. Would the other children be kind? Would they feel out of place? The questions nagged at him throughout the day, making him impatient for the afternoon when he would return to collect them. When he arrived at the schoolhouse as classes were dismissing, he scanned the crowd of children anxiously. He spotted Charlotte first, her blonde head rising above many of the others. She had an arm around Margaret, who looked smaller than ever amid the boisterous local children. Ruth walked slightly apart, clutching her books to her chest like a shield. Their expressions as they climbed into the wagon told him all he needed to know before they spoke. "How was it?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Fine, thank you," Charlotte replied with forced politeness. Ruth was more forthcoming. "They called us charity cases. Said we were sent west because nobody back east wanted us." Thomas felt a surge of anger on their behalf. "That ain't true. And those children don't know what they're talking about." "It's all right," Charlotte said, her voice steady though her eyes betrayed her hurt. "We've heard worse at the orphanage." Margaret remained silent, but when they arrived home, she disappeared upstairs immediately. Thomas found her later in her room, crying quietly into her pillow. "Hey now," he said softly, sitting awkwardly on the edge of her bed. "School will get better. First days are always hard. I want to go home," Margaret sobbed. The words struck Thomas like a physical blow. "This is your home now," he said gently. Margaret raised her tear-stained face. "No, it's not. Home was with Mama before she got sick. Then it was the orphanage with Miss Sarah who told us stories. This is just another place they've sent us until they decide to send us somewhere else." Her words pierced Thomas deeper than he'd expected. He'd never considered himself sentimental, yet here he was, wounded by a child's honest assessment of her situation. "Margaret," he said carefully, "I know this isn't what you're used to. It's not what I'm used to either, but I'm not planning on sending you anywhere. You and your sisters are staying right here, as long as you want to." Margaret looked at him suspiciously through her tears. "Even if we're bad? Even if the rain never comes and your cows all die?" Thomas surprised himself with a chuckle. "Even then, we're in this together now, drought and all." He awkwardly patted her small shoulder, then stood to leave. At the door, he paused. "Would it help if Scout slept in here tonight? He's a good companion when you're feeling low." Margaret considered this, then nodded, her tears subsiding somewhat. Thomas whistled softly, and Scout trotted up the stairs, seeming to understand his mission as he jumped onto the bed and settled beside Margaret, who cautiously curled an arm around his furry neck. That night, Thomas sat on the porch long after the girls had gone to bed, contemplating the day's events. He'd expected challenges in taking in 3 orphans, but he hadn't anticipated how quickly their welfare would come to matter to him. Their hurts felt like his own in a way he hadn't experienced in years, not since losing his younger brother in the war. The memory of Jacob, barely 18 when he fell at Chancellorsville, was still sharp enough to make Thomas wince. He'd promised their mother he'd look after the boy, bring him home safe. That failure had driven him west, away from the family farm in Ohio and the memories it held. Now, somehow, he'd acquired a new kind of family, one he hadn't sought but suddenly couldn't imagine abandoning. The following weeks brought gradual improvements. School became easier as the girls settled in and proved their abilities. Charlotte excelled in history and literature, earning reluctant respect from her classmates. Ruth's mathematical prowess made her valuable during arithmetic competitions. Even Margaret began to find her place, her natural charm and Scout's popularity, who occasionally followed the girls to school, helping to break down barriers. At home, the adjustment continued. Thomas found himself learning new skills: how to braid Margaret's unruly hair, how to mediate disputes between sisters, how to provide comfort for childhood nightmares that had less to do with monsters under the bed and more to do with real traumas endured. For their part, the girls began to relax into the rhythms of ranch life. They still worked hard, but there was play too, something that had been in short supply at the orphanage. On Sundays after church, Thomas took them riding, teaching each to handle a horse with confidence. Charlotte proved to be a natural horsewoman, her usual caution giving way to exhilaration as she galloped across the open land. Ruth preferred slower, methodical rides, taking note of every plant and animal they encountered. Margaret was fearless but small, requiring a gentle mare that Thomas purchased specifically for her, straining his limited finances but considering it worthwhile for the joy it brought. The drought, however, showed no signs of abating. The promising clouds Thomas had spotted the night of the girls' arrival had dissipated by morning, leaving only the relentless blue sky. More cattle died, despite his best efforts, and the stipend money intended for the girls' needs was increasingly diverted to keeping the ranch afloat. Thomas did his best to shield the girls from his financial worries, but Charlotte, ever observant, confronted him one evening after the younger ones had gone to bed. "We're not helping, are we?" she asked bluntly. "The money they send for us, it's not enough." Thomas looked up from the account books he'd been frowning over. "That's not something for you to worry about." "But it is," Charlotte insisted, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. "I'm old enough to understand. The ranch was already struggling before we came. Now there are 4 more mouths to feed." "3," Thomas corrected automatically. "And you're worth every penny and more." He closed the ledger with a sigh. "We'll get by. Always have." Charlotte studied him with those serious blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "I could leave school, work full-time on the ranch, or find employment in town." Mrs. Peterson mentioned needing help at the store. "Absolutely not," Thomas said firmly. "Your education comes first. That's non-negotiable." "But, Charlotte," he interrupted, his voice gentler, "I appreciate your offer. Truly, but that's not how this works. I'm the adult here. It's my job to provide, not yours." A flicker of something, frustration, perhaps, or a deeper emotion crossed her face. That's what my father used to say before he died. Then my mother worked herself to death trying to provide for me. Thomas reached across the table, hesitating before placing his hand over hers. I'm not going anywhere. We'll weather this drought together, and we'll come out the other side. I promise. Charlotte didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded. As she stood to leave, she paused. Mr. Thomas, she said, using the compromise name the girls had settled on. Thank you. For taking us in. For treating us like we matter. Before he could respond, she hurried from the room, leaving Thomas to wonder at the depth of neglect these children must have experienced to be grateful for such basic decency. The next day brought an unexpected visitor. Thomas was repairing fencing in the north pasture when he spotted a rider approaching. As the figure drew closer, he recognized Eli Jackson, his neighbor. Tom, Eli called, reining in his horse. Been a while since I've seen you in town. Figured I'd ride over, see how you're faring with your new brood. Thomas straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. We're managing. Eli dismounted, tying his horse to the fence post. Heard they're doing well at school. Miss Clark speaks highly of them. They're smart girls, Thomas agreed, pride evident in his voice despite his attempt at casualness. Quick learners. Eli studied him with interest. You look different, Tom. Less sour. Thomas snorted. Just because I'm not scowling at you doesn't mean I've gone soft. Never said soft, Eli countered with a grin. Just maybe a bit more human. His expression grew more serious. But that's not the only reason I rode out here. Got news you'll want to hear. Thomas raised an eyebrow, waiting. Railroad's coming through, Eli said. Not directly through Dry Creek, but close enough. They're setting up a new station about 10 miles east, where the old stage route crosses Simpsons Creek. Thomas considered this information. The railroad meant access to markets in California and back east, better prices for cattle, more settlers, potential prosperity if they could hold on long enough. When? He asked. Construction starts next month. They're hiring local men for the work. Paying good wages too, $3 a day. $3 a day was significant money in these parts, more than most ranch hands made in a week. Thomas felt a flicker of temptation. He could work for the railroad, keep the ranch, provide properly for the girls. I know what you're thinking, Eli said, reading his expression. But who'd run your place while you're gone all day? Those girls can't manage everything, no matter how capable they seem. Thomas frowned. I wasn't considering it. Sure you weren't, Eli replied skeptically. Anyway, there's more. With the railroad coming, land values are going to rise. Significantly, especially land with water access. My land doesn't have reliable water, Thomas pointed out. That's the whole problem. Ili ned glosiv. But it will. Simpsons Creek never runs dry, even the worst drought. The new station means they'll be diverting some of that water this way. Your north pasture could have access. Thomas absorbed this information slowly, seeing the implications. They'd have to run the water across your land to get to mine. Eli nodded, which is why I'm here. I'm proposing a partnership. I grant right-of-way for the water diversion across my property. In exchange, we combine our herds, split the profits 60-40. 60-40? Thomas questioned. I have more cattle surviving, Eli said pragmatically. And the water access is coming through my arrangement with the railroad company. It wasn't an unreasonable offer, especially given Thomas's precarious financial situation. Still, he hesitated. Partnership meant surrendering some control, becoming accountable to someone else. I need to think about it, he said finally. Eli nodded. Of course, but don't think too long. Railroad men will be here next week to survey. They'll want agreements in place. After Eli departed, Thomas continued working on the fence, his mind churning with possibilities. The railroad could be their salvation, or it could change everything about the life he'd built here, the independence he valued. When he returned to the house that evening, he found the girls gathered around the kitchen table, an unusual tension in the air. Charlotte stood with her arms crossed, while Ruth appeared to be holding back tears. Margaret sat silently, her eyes wide. What's happened? Thomas asked, immediately concerned. Charlotte spoke first, her voice tight. Tell him, Ruth. Ruth looked down at the table. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I was returning a book to Miss Clark after school, and her door was open. She was speaking with Mayor Holbrook. Thomas waited, a sense of foreboding growing. They were discussing us, Ruth continued. The mayor said that if the drought continues, you might not be able to keep the ranch. Miss Clark said that in that case, alternative arrangements would need to be made for us. Alternative arrangements? Thomas repeated, anger rising. What does that mean? It means they'd send us away, Charlotte said bluntly. Split us up, probably. Margaret's young enough to be adopted easily. Ruth and I would likely be sent to different households as domestic help. Thomas looked at their faces, Charlotte's defiant, Ruth's fearful, Margaret's confused, and felt a surge of protectiveness so powerful it nearly took his breath away. That's not happening, he said with quiet certainty. Not now, not ever. You're staying right here with me. But the ranch, Charlotte began. We'll survive, Thomas interrupted. One way or another. About options I'm considering. He crouched down to look Margaret in the eye. Remember what I promised you? We're in this together. All of us. Margaret nodded solemnly, some of the worry leaving her face. Now, Thomas said, straightening up, I believe it's my turn to cook dinner tonight. Who's going to help me make the world's worst biscuits? The tension broke as Ruth giggled despite herself. Yours are pretty terrible, she admitted. Tough as saddle leather, Charlotte agreed, a reluctant smile forming. Then it's fortunate I have 3 excellent teachers, Thomas replied, grateful to see their spirits lifting. That night, after the girls were asleep, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, calculating figures long into the night. By dawn, he'd made his decision. He would accept Eli's partnership offer, but with modifications. He'd propose a 50-50 split, with Thomas contributing labor on the water diversion project as part of his investment. It wasn't ideal. Partnership meant compromise, sharing decisions about the ranch he'd built alone. But the alternative, losing the ranch, losing the girls, was unthinkable. Somewhere along the way, these 3 orphans had become his family, and Thomas Blackwood would do whatever was necessary to keep his family together.